Hello and welcome to the third talk of our online series, Behind the Scenes, Analysing Anglo-Saxon Rendlesham. I'm Alice DeLeo, the Project Delivery Officer at Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, and today we'll be hearing from Faye Minter about the metal objects recovered at Rendlesham. We're excited to be hosting this online series in partnership with two projects. Rendlesham Revealed, led by Suffolk County Council, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and Lordship and Landscape, led by Christopher Scull, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Now let me introduce you to Faye Minter. Faye is a Senior Archaeological Officer at Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service and manages the Suffolk Finds Recording Team, which is part of the National Portable Antiquities Scheme. Faye has been involved with the work at Rendlesham since the beginning in 2007 and is now the manager of the Rendlesham Revealed project. She is also one of the find specialists working with the Lordship and Landscape project. So Faye, when you're ready, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see something. If not, do shout. So today I'd like to focus on the 5th to 8th century metal finds from Rendlesham. I want to look more closely at the objects themselves. We will review how these objects were found, as this has implication for the types of material we have to work with. We will then explore what light they can shed on costume through time, cultural identities, interregional connections and social differentiation within the community at Rendlesham. The metal finds from Rendlesham were all recovered using metal detectors. We would have achieved nothing without the expertise of Alan Smith, Roy Demant, Terry Marsh and Rob Atfield, local independent metal detector users, all of whom had worked on both commercial archaeological projects and their own sites, recording their finds with the Portable Antiquities Scheme and before that directly with Suffolk County Council. Based on the results of their initial work, the project was extended and the results of the metal detecting survey have been core to revealing the true scale and nature of the Rendlesham site. At Rendlesham, our metal detecting methodology has applied the archaeological principles of systematic coverage to 172 hectares of arable land. As you can see here, we are aiming for 100% coverage. To achieve this, the detecting was carried out walking in straight lines, with individuals a detector sweep apart. Here you can see the evenly spaced tracks where the detectorists have walked and covered the ground in this manner. Now, the detecting survey was not intended to sterilise the site by removing all archaeological material from the plough soil. It aimed instead to recover a representative sample of non-ferrous metal artefacts so the date and nature of past human activity could be securely characterised and its significance and research potential assessed. All fields were detected at least twice in this way, but there is variability in how intensively areas were surveyed due to different agricultural availability, and the more productive fields were subject to more repeat visits. Stuart Brooks has kindly normalised the data for each field, which is the plot you can see here. The darker the field, the higher the density of finds. Because the data has been normalised in this way, we know these concentrations are real and not purely the result of more intensive metal detecting. Now, all the objects recovered were found in the top 15 to 20 centimetres of the plough soil. They've long since been removed from their archaeological context by agriculture. So how did the objects get in the plough soil? The majority of items found at Rendlesham are probably the result of accidental loss, whether originally had fallen off clothing or equipment during use, or been thrown away onto old ground surfaces, rubbish heaps and floors. Some may have been from disturbed graves, but all have been pulled into the plough soil by agricultural activity. On arable fields, ploughing disperses archaeological material, however it got there. The extent of dispersal can be assessed at Rendlesham by looking at fragments of the same objects that have moved apart by ploughing. 53 finds have been identified as pieces from 24 original objects. Some pieces of the same object were found on the same day, others were found 3 years apart. The distance between fragments indicates movement since breakage, not deposition. And here you can see some of the adjoining Anglo-Saxon finds. And we've got here, I hope you can see my cursor, we've got here Cruciform brooches. They're missing their head plates and you can see the breaks across the feet. We've got 2 fragments of a hanging bowl mount, and a gold pendant which is broken into 3 pieces, and a belt mount, a copper alloy gilt belt mount at the end there. All the adjoining fragments were found within the same fields, and in most cases between 2 to 40 metres apart. They have also mostly moved in the direction of the present line of tillage. There is only a weak correlation with slope, indicating that this had little impact on overall patterns of fines density. In total, the detectorists have spent 1,740 days at Rendlesham between 2008 and 2017. Doing the survey over so many years using the same small team and working closely with the farmer and landowner, often within very narrow windows of opportunity between cultivation cycles, has allowed archaeological understanding of the site to develop. As a bonus of this continued systematic metals detecting, we've seen a rapid decrease in the amount of illegal looting, and there are clearly therefore benefits of considering this approach elsewhere. All objects thought to be older than 1650 were located as they were found with a handheld global positioning system and labelled and bagged individually in the field, and here you can see Rob doing just that. This excellent locational data has allowed the find spots of all objects recovered to be integrated into the same GIS environment as the other survey data. Now, I cannot stress how important these find spots are. It is only if we have good find spots for every find that we're able to begin to try and ask questions and interpret the data. This map that you can see now shows the find spots, each one represented by a blue dot, and it shows all the 5th to 8th century objects. The combination of excellent find spots, what we know about object movement within the plough soil, and evidence from our other survey techniques and our small excavated trenches allows us to be confident that the Rendlesham objects can be used as material signatures for different types of activity. As we know that the artefacts in the plough soil at Rendlesham have retained varying levels of connection spatially to the activities and features from which they are derived. Now, the best example of this are these burnt objects. So here you can see some burnt brooch fragments at the top, a burnt wrist clasp in the middle, a bead, and a pottery fragment. These finds indicated to us that there is likely to be a cremation cemetery in the northern part of this field. And here on the screen you can also see the results of an evaluation trench in this area and one of the damaged urns cremations found. Given the number and area over which the burnt finds were scattered, we think there are possibly 1,000 disturbed cremations in this field. Other types of activity are not so straightforward to predict from plough zone finds. For example, a concentration of 5th to 7th century dress accessories, such as the ones here, the wrist clasps, brooches and girdle hanger fragments, are usually taken to indicate inhumation graves. But such finds also occur in settlement assemblages, and when we put in a trench where the finds were concentrated at Rendlesham, we found a small series of rubbish pits and sunken feature buildings, huts with cellars like those at West Stow. So although these finds could and probably do indicate inhumations in the vicinity, the archaeological evidence has actually revealed a contemporary 5th to 6th century settlement. So care must be taken when interpreting activities from plough zone finds. It is not as simple as one type of object indicating one type of activity, and rather than presence or absence, we need to look at specific object indicators and use other survey techniques and excavation to test our theories. In total, 5,201 objects of pre-1650 date have been found. All have been recorded onto the Rendlesham Project database, a summary version of which will be made available on the Archaeological Data Service website as part of the Lordship and Landscape project. These 5,000 odd finds represent only a tiny fraction of the material actually found, estimated by the detectorists to be about 130,000 items, the bulk of which related to sporting or agricultural activity over the last 100 years. And here you can see a lead musket ball and a shotgun cartridge. 1,364 of the Rendlesham objects are 5th to 11th century in date. This is 27% of the total assemblage. The proportion of finds of this date reported from Suffolk as a whole through the Port of Antiquities scheme is 5%, so the quantity of finds alone indicates that Rendlesham was a major focus in the early medieval or Anglo-Saxon period. 65% of the Rendlesham assemblage, excluding coins, is of 5th to early 8th century date. If you follow the red line on this graph, you can see a peak in the number of objects found and therefore activity between AD 450 and 700, which is indicated on your screen by the blue arrows. At Rendlesham, the volume of finds in the 6th to 7th centuries is higher than any other period, followed by a strong fall in the 8th century. The activity at Rendlesham is in stark contrast to that regionally and nationally, as there are low volumes of finds at this time, with a slight rise in the 6th century, possibly due to metal detector finds from disturbed burials. As you can see here, if you follow the red line indicating the number of finds from the Suffolk Port of Antiquities scheme, we do not have the same 5th to 8th century peak that we saw at Rendlesham. Excluding coins, which Andrew Woods is going to be talking about, we have 1,109 early medieval or Anglo-Saxon artefacts. Most objects are either broken or fragmentary, as you can see here. Many were incomplete when lost or discarded, and there has been further damage in the plough soil. Some have been cut or broken for recycling in metalworking, and some are cremated grave goods. High levels of fragmentation mean that some objects cannot be fully identified or closely dated, and that it is also difficult to assess accurately the incidence of repair and reuse, which appears lower than that seen nationally on objects such as brooches. As well as the problems of fragmentation, we also have a bias generated by searching primarily for metal. The detectorists did still collect pottery and other surface finds, but conditions were not great for field walking, and only 7% of the objects are non-metallic. Here you can see two examples of iron knives, but the detectors were set to screen out iron. This decision was made as retrieving every iron signal would have made the survey impossibly slow, as sieving the plough soil in the 2013 evaluation confirmed where a very large amount of modern or undateable iron was recovered. This has, however, biased the collection towards copper alloy objects. 66% of all finds recovered are copper alloy. This in turn has led to a bias towards female dress accessories. Distinctive iron masculine objects such as shield studs, weapons and sword fittings, and whole categories of objects such as tools, which would have been made of iron, make up only a small proportion of the Rendlesham collection. As any metal detector users in the audience will also know, finds retrieval is affected by ground conditions and the composition, size and shape of the objects. Given the collection bias, it is perhaps unsurprising that 59% of the objects recovered are copper alloy dress accessories, metal items that are both functional and decorative, used in dress and costume, almost overwhelmingly by women, a category dominated by buckles and brooches. A large proportion of these are probably from 5th to 7th century furnished burials. There are also relatively high numbers of objects of the same date range linked to weapons, metalworking and currency use. Now, I thought next that we would take a chronological look at some of the objects to see what they can begin to reveal about the costume, cultural identities, interregional connections and social differentiation within the community at Rendlesham. Now, by social differentiation, I mean objects that seem to suggest their owners had different levels of primarily economic status. So this could include common objects that are perhaps gilded or enhanced at the lower end of this scale, and elite or higher stated objects at the other. At Rendlesham, the types of objects we've taken as elite indicators are primarily those made of precious metal, items with garnet, metal vessels from northern or western Britain, the continent or Mediterranean, and elaborate horse harness or weapon fittings. Such objects only make up 7.5% of the 5th to 8th century assemblage, and the overwhelming majority of the items are utilitarian copper alloy. This is just to remind you, this is the finds distribution of the 5th and 6th century finds, so you can see the focus of activity is to the north and the east of the stream, where, as Chris has said, there was an extensive settlement with 2 cemeteries. In the early and middle years of the 5th century, it was a period of direct and intense cultural interactions across and around the North Sea, which included migration from the continent to eastern Britain. Indeed, the earliest post-Roman dress accessories found at Rendlesham point to overseas connections with the North Sea coastal regions of what are now northern France and Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany and southern Scandinavia. Here you can see two of the early cruciform brooches that may have been made in North Germany, the Netherlands or southern Scandinavia, and a fragment of a continental supporting arm brooch. These are relatively rare in Suffolk, although we do have examples from Coddenham, Mildenhall, Pakenham and Stonham Aspel. You can also see on this slide some drawings of the objects, and I will use these throughout as they can show more detail than the photographs, and they've all been drawn by our excellent illustrator, Donna Reethel. The fragmentary objects that you can now see indicate both clear cultural affinities with southern Scandinavia and social differentiation amongst the population at Rendlesham from the early to middle 5th century. You can see fragments of a silver gilt sword buckle. These buckles have composite plates with a circular frame with geometric decoration. Such buckles are becoming more widely recognised through metal detector finds. An example from Lakenheath, Suffolk, is a cast silver gilt copy of this type. These buckles were part of a sword suspension and associated with high quality scabbards with silver gilt mouthbands, and you can see a fragment of such a mouthband with a very high quality geometric chip carving on your screen. It is closely paralleled with scabbard fittings from Sweden. Together, these fragments appear to represent an elite South Scandinavian scabbard and sword belt, presumably with a weapon to match, and could suggest the presence of a warrior elite at Rendlesham with South Scandinavian connections. We also have a silver fragment of an equal arm brooch, which you can see here. It is very similar to a complete copper alloy example from Lydgate, Suffolk, and also suggests an elite presence in the first half of the 5th century. The urn cremations we have already seen are broadly contemporary with these finds and also indicate the use of a cultural tradition adopted from the continent. A few of the early dress accessories may represent evidence for marriage connections arriving at Rendlesham worn by women. These include this disc brooch of a type found in burials in northern France, and this rare silver gilt horse and rider brooch with parallels in France and the Netherlands, dated to the middle and later 5th century. So the presence of a small number of early finds from the North Sea coastal regions does demonstrate contacts at Rendlesham, but does not imply population replacement. Migration of people was likely to be complex, including movements to Britain from the continent and back again by the middle and 3rd quarter of the 5th century. The material signature of the communities at Rendlesham by then was characteristic of the wider North Sea cultural province. With further insular developments of types and traditions of continental origin, now these new types of objects are all restricted to and likely to have developed in Eastern England. For example, both of these brooches may represent the insular take-up and development of continental types. The brooch on the left has a simpler pin configuration as it has a single pin lug, and the continental examples have a double pin lug, and the brooch on the right is a copper alloy copy of a silver continental type known from Lower Saxony. Now, as you can see on this graph, we have an awful lot of cruciform brooches, the most frequently occurring brooch type by far, with 79 examples, followed by the contemporary small longs and fragments of brooches which could be of either type. Only one complete cruciform brooch was found. 16 examples show evidence of burning and are likely to have been cremated, and all are copper alloy. Such brooches were worn by women in pairs at the shoulder, with the sleeveless tubular garment or peblos, and singly to fasten cloaks. Indeed, given the date of our examples, 76% of which are 475 to 550 AD in date, they are likely to have mainly been used for the latter. Apart from the two early examples mentioned above, all the Rendlesham cruciform brooches appear to be insular types. They all have been restricted to and likely to have developed in Eastern England. Here you can see two examples of these early insular types. The first is a foot fragment with long tapering catchplate similar to Kentish examples, and has distinctive elongated oval eyes paralleled with the brooch at Leverhulme, Kent. It appears to have been cremated, which is consistent with its early date. The second brooch is the only complete example and represents the first stage of insular development in England, joining other examples concentrated in East Anglia and Lincolnshire. You can also see a detached brooch knob, which unusually has been decorated with applied silver wire, which may have indicated that the wearer had a slightly higher status. Below this, you can see a rare example of a possible repair or reuse. The small notch in the horsehead terminal may have been a riveted repair or possibly a perforation for reuse as a pendant. It is significant that there are so many cruciform brooches at Rendlesham, as these are seen as strongly symbolic of Eastern English female identity, and brooch types considered typical of insular Saxon areas, notably saucer brooches, are almost entirely absent. Also striking at Rendlesham is the small number of annular brooches. Annular brooches were used in pairs as peblos fasteners and are most often the most common brooch type found in East Anglian inhumation cemeteries. Only 9 annular brooches were found, as opposed to 79 cruciforms. To some extent, this might be explained by the high proportion of cruciform fragments represented by knobs and feet. Or perhaps the thin curvilinear shape of the fragmentary annular brooches is less susceptible to metal texting. However, the difference may also reflect local preference and cultural tradition, or even represent a difference between brooches commonly worn and lost and those selected for burial. We have a significant number of wrist clasp elements, 40 in total. Wrist or sleeve clasps are securely dated to the later 5th and first half of the 6th century. They were worn at the cuffs of a sleeved inner garment. We have 2 examples that are part of a wider pattern showing close cultural contacts and population movement between Eastern England and Western Scandinavia in the later 5th century. All the others represent the insular development of clasp forms. Interesting examples that you can see here include a gilded example, and we have 2 potentially matching elements from a single clasp, a hook piece and a catch piece, found just under 10 metres apart. We also have a rare type with parallels from Codnam and West Stow, which is decorated with stamped amulets, and lastly, a silver example. The only clear examples of typical Anglian material culture types in precious metal are 2 silver wrist clasps and 2 fragments of possible silver gusset plates. These are decorative additions to wrist clasps, but separate from the clasps themselves. We also have this gold bucket pendant, which can be assigned to an Anglian tradition, but is a unique piece. It is made from ribbed gold sheet with a soldered base and lugs. Bucket pendants of copper alloy sheets occur in female graves and are assumed to have amuletic significance. Perhaps this object is an elaborate elite version in gold of what was normally a plainer item. The clearest evidence for long-distance social and cultural contacts at Rendlesham and for the presence of people with connections to elite interregional networks is provided by the 2 gold bracteates. These pendants were created from impressed circular gold medallions originating in the 5th century in southern Scandinavia as imitations of imperial Roman medallions and gold coins. Such pendants became widely adopted and distributed around the North Sea coastal territories in the later 5th and earlier 6th centuries. The Rendlesham examples show plough zone damage. They were found in separate fields, which suggests that they are not from a dispersed hoard. Bracteates are known from female inhumations of the first half of the 6th century in Kent, and so our examples might be from burials. A further possibility is that they were collected for recycling. And here you can see on your right the adjoining fragments of the Rendlesham B-bracteate depicting a warrior fighting a beast, and it's very similar to the B-bracteates found as part of a hoard at Binham, Norfolk, deposited in the first half of the 6th century. These Binham examples are di-identical to 7 examples from Germany. Now it is an open question as to whether the Rendlesham example was made in England or on the continent. The second Rendlesham example is this D-bracteate depicting a ribbon-like style 1 animal. It was struck from the same die as an example from Northbourne, Kent, which you can see next to it. D-bracteates are the commonest type in England, with the main concentration in Kent, and insular manufacture is more likely in this case. By the mid-6th century, we know we have increasing Merovingian, continental and Kentish contacts at Rendlesham as we start to have more objects such as these. Whether of insular or continental manufacture and however acquired, they indicate social networks with access to continental examples and the presence of people who were concerned at some level to signal affiliation with continental and Kentish identities. And here you can see a gilded copper alloy disc brooch with a central garnet setting and a band of animal art style 1 ornament, a gilded copper alloy buckle tongue with a rectangular garnet setting, and a fragment of a silver radiate headed brooch of a type found in France, the Rhineland and Kent. I hope you're all still with me, because now we're going to move on into the later 6th century, and it is at this point onwards until the 8th century that there is a change in the finds distribution. As you can see here, activity intensifies and extends more onto the promontory, which is circled for you in red. This late 6th century shift in activity can also be seen when we only look at the elite metalwork. As you can see circled in red, there is greater activity on the promontory, where it appears that a hall complex is established. From the later 6th century to later 7th century, the assemblage shows insular material culture signature common to that of Eastern and Southern England, with a sharp decrease in the number of brooches, which reflects the national picture. At Rendlesham, these copper alloy pins of a type found in Kent and southern East Anglia from both female graves and settlements begin to appear. This pin type is the most common one at Rendlesham and appears to have been manufactured on the site, as we have 6 unfinished examples, some of which you can see here, which Ellie Blakelock will be telling you about soon. The number of buckles recovered also increases from the later 6th century. 101 copper alloy buckle loops of simple forms have been found, as well as evidence for the manufacture of buckle loops on site. There are 22 tiny copper alloy buckles, most of which would have had straps 5 to 9 millimeters wide, examples of which you can see here. These small buckles may represent a costume innovation adopted from the Merovingian continent and first seen in England in Kentish inhumations. They were probably used on garter straps, which helped to secure footwear. Material relating to a 6th and 7th century swords is also present, including 3 copper alloy pommel caps of cocked hat type. You can see how the more elaborate versions would have been used on this reconstruction here at the top. There is one plain example from Rendlesham, which would have been used perhaps as a core and had more elaborate applied decoration, and 2 decorated examples. The first of these has a white metal coating, and the second has a quatrefoil motif. This motif, sometimes inlaid with red enamel, is known from dress accessories from several sites in northwest Suffolk, and you can see here the same motif on a wrist clasp from Codnam. Perhaps the most significant sword-related find is the lead sword model for the casting of a metal fixed pommel ring. Fittings of this type are rare in England and more common in France and Germany. There is a silver example in the Staffordshire hoard though. Now this model links the manufacture of an exclusive sword hilt fitting directly to Rendlesham around the first half of the 7th century. We also have some pyramid mounts, which were part of the apparatus whereby the scabbard was attached to the sword belt. And again, you can see some more elaborate examples of these on the reconstruction photograph. This one object type shows different levels of social differentiation. You can see here a plain copper alloy example. And then next to it, you can see a copper alloy example with gold foils and now empty probable garnet inlays. And the final example was constructed with gold and garnet inlays over a silver core. This example is unique as it has filigree directly over the garnet inlays, although the overall design of a square garnet on top and side panels of filigree sheet is paralleled on a smaller example from Tostock, Suffolk, that you can see next to it, and combinations of filigree with slab garnets are seen on the pyramid fittings from the Staffordshire hoard. We have increasing evidence for long-distance social and cultural contacts in the later 6th and 7th centuries, whether direct or indirect. The geographical reach of Rendlesham was greater at this period than at any other. We have evidence of items circulating in elite social and exchange networks. You can see here some of that material. We have an unfinished large gold shoe-shaped stud, a unique piece that must have been intended for an elite belt set, a radiate-headed brooch fragment from the continent, hanging bowl mounts from northern and western Britain, and fragments of cast copper alloy basins from the eastern Mediterranean. We also have gold and Byzantine coinage, which Andrew Woods will be talking about. The presence of Byzantine coinage seems to indicate that the contemporary objects could be arriving with merchants coming to trade at Rendlesham, not only as traditionally thought by gift exchange. The elite objects of the first half of the 7th century include the gold and garnet bead, which is unique, the sword pyramid mount, which you've seen previously, and gold coin pendants. From this point onwards, the majority of the elite items are now made of gold, rather than the silver objects that we've previously seen. Moving into the middle and later 7th century, we then see the gold spacer beads made of both sheet and wire, and gold and garnet pendants. Now these are similar to those from Hoxton, Suffolk, which you can see there on your right, and from the Desborough necklace from Northamptonshire, which you can also see represented. Rendlesham also has gold filigree pendants, similar to those found at Boss Hall, Ipswich. It seems that both the elite gold and garnet jewellery and the fittings and the contemporary plain copper alloy buckles and pins that we saw earlier were both being made at Rendlesham during the later 6th and 7th centuries, so craft workers were producing items for people across the social range, which Ellie will fill you in on when she talks about metalworking. The hanging bowls, Eastern Mediterranean basins, and this circular animal art style 2 harness fitting, taken together with the gold and garnet pieces, represent the types of objects seen in later 6th and 7th century princely burials, like that at Sutton Hoo. Although we do not know where the Sutton Hoo treasures were made, or even how many workshops there were at the time, it is items like these being made and worn by the people at Rendlesham that may have been buried with their dead kin at nearby sites such as Sutton Hoo. The Rendlesham harness mount is large and gilded with a zoomorphic style 2 interlace. It has a central white setting topped with a circular inset of garnet or red glass. It is especially like the Sutton Hoo harness mounts from Mound 17, where a young man was buried with his horse. Here you can see the Rendlesham and Sutton Hoo harness mounts and where such mounts may have been worn on the horse. A further link may exist between the Rendlesham and Sutton Hoo objects. You can see here reconstructions of the great gold buckle and the ornamental purse lid from Mound 1. I have circled the beaks of the birds, and you can see that they are divided by a Y-shaped groove. Here you can see a mount fragment and a balance beam fragment from Rendlesham, which again have this Y-shaped groove on the bird's beaks. Other finds with the detail have been found in Eastern England, including on some of the objects such as the Great Cross in the Staffordshire hoard. This may be an interesting coincidence, or it may support the case for this Y-shaped groove being a signature of an East Anglian metalworking workshop, or perhaps a trait of an individual craftsman. Okay, I hope we're all still there, but we've reached the 7th century, when long-lived dress accessories such as hook tags and strap ends start to appear. These forms continue on through to the 11th century. Pins and buckles continue to be the main utilitarian copper alloy dress accessories, with more unusual examples including 2 counterplates from continental belt suites of mid to late 7th century date. These are rare in England, but known from continental style burials at Ipswich and Southampton. The dominant brooch type from the late 7th century is the Ansate or caterpillar brooch. We have 22 examples of these. They are a 7th to 10th century type on the continent, first appearing in furnished burials in northern France and the Rhineland. Their initial introduction and adoption is linked to communication and commercial networks around the North Sea. Although in origin a continental type, it seems that a brief period of importation was followed by large-scale production in England. We have one early example, presumably an import, but most of the rest were probably manufactured locally. The latest unequivocally elite items at Rendlesham are the gold animal-headed pin of late 7th or early 8th century date and the silver-gilt possible pinhead fragment of 8th century date that you can see here. From the 8th century, the number of artefacts at Rendlesham begins to reduce and activity seems to decrease and represent that of a normal rural site. So I hope that this has given you an overview of the types of objects that we've recovered and show you that the plough soil objects at Rendlesham can be used as material signatures for different types of activity. At Rendlesham, in a single assemblage, long-term trends in dress accessories can be seen, which are normally visible only at regional and national levels. The pattern of cultural identity is signalled by the objects that you have seen today, and the main changes in their expression over time are consistent with the broader patterns within East Anglia and Eastern England. They indicate that the local population of Rendlesham across the 5th to 8th centuries was probably made up of individuals of native, continental and mixed descent, whose cultural identities and their material expressions were no doubt the products of complex dynamics. Finally, we have seen the elite presence at Rendlesham reflected in the objects from the 5th to the end of the 7th centuries. Thank you very much.